Well, greetings and salutations, everyone, and welcome to today's bonus. Before we jump into it, a couple links. As many of you know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, channel membership, and the merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. Links to Patreon, PayPal, and channel membership is in the description below. Merch displayed directly under the video. Also, Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 1 through 3, the audiobook versions. They were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeff Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, links to which are also in the description as well. And finally, last but definitely not least, if you'd really like to help support the channel to continue to grow and go, simply subscribe. It does not cost a cent. Click the like button, takes half a second. If you don't want to miss out on any of the informative uploads I put out daily, click that bell icon. And folks, please leave a comment and share the video. Why? Well, because all of these things really do help the channel to continue to grow and go. And folks, they definitely matter. Now, everyone, I have taken far too much of your time. Let's jump into today's bonus upload, shall we? Today's first encounter. Sometime in late summer, it was getting close to fall, I'd say late September. My husband and I were going through hard times, living homeless in the woods of Norman, Oklahoma. The exact location, I believe, was on West Robinson Street, right next to Crest Grocery Store. We had picked that location because it was conveniently located next to a grocery store for when we would need to get food. There were also hotels nearby when we wanted to shower up and could afford a hotel with what money we made from our paychecks. Legacy Park was across the street, so we could use the bathroom there as well. Anyway, we stayed in those woods for about 2 months before we saved enough money to get a bus ticket out of town. My husband would hear things at night in our tent before he would come and walk me back from work. It sounded like a woman talking. I thought he may be hearing echoes of voices from walkers across the street at the park or the store. But he acted like it was right behind him, near our tent. We were pretty far in the woods because at one point we weren't the only people in there. We wanted to be far enough away from the other homeless people to give them privacy and us as well. Plus, we had a looter before he had gone through our tent, so we were just trying to go unseen, more or less. We had been seeing a huge owl that used to sit right above our tent, and in my tribe, the owl is a messenger. It's usually a sign of death or a bad omen. It would stare straight down at our tent some nights and just sit there for a very long time. I used to open the flap of the window in our tent and just see it staring at me, which definitely freaked me out. Then it would fly away, and the sound of it flapping its wings was very loud. For a week or so, it came almost every night and sat on the tree that we were under. Not too long after that was when the scariest night that we had experienced there happened. We always burned all of our trash. My husband would burn it away from the tent. So we had made this little path. There was other junk there from what people had left behind. Well, he was just getting done burning our trash one night in the junk pile, putting the fire out. There was this huge cedar tree that was behind him, and its limbs up top had started to break as if something was crashing down above his head. It scared him, and he moved out of the way, but there was nothing there that he could see. Right after he heard that, he was looking around. Something started chasing him out of the area. I'd been sitting in the tent around the corner. I suddenly heard running feet go past our tent, and then it stopped. There was nothing behind our tent, though, except thick brush and thorns. And if anything or anyone ran in there, it would have gotten stuck, or we would have heard the leaves crunching. I thought it was my husband, and I yelled out to him, kind of laughing, "What are you doing?" But there was no response. Then immediately after, I saw my husband running toward our tent, down that path from around the corner where the trash pile was. That freaked me out then, because I wondered what had just ran on the side of our tent and stopped. It sounded like 2 feet running, like a person. I tried to explain it away as possibly a raccoon or other wildlife, even though the only animals we had seen was one armadillo. And these footsteps were very heavy, like a human or a person running. Anyway, he gets toward the tent and he's yelling at me to hurry and open the door of the tent. I had never seen him that spooked before. He said something was chasing him and it was big. I asked him if he saw it. He said he didn't see anything. It was dark, but he had felt it behind him. I seriously, for a moment, thought there was some crazed crackhead running loose in the woods or something, especially when the cops had just been there the month before looking for a suspect that ran in those woods after breaking into a nearby Academy Sports. After we were both in the tent freaking out, we heard this loud, high-pitched sound. It sounded like it was right near our tent. Then, in an instant, it's echoing toward the hotel on the other side of the woods. It sounded as if it was flying away, screeching. You could hear tree limbs cracking as it did so. It was the strangest experience that ever happened to me in woods before, and I've lived in Oklahoma and Kansas most of my life. That sound was like a high screech whistling from low to high. I cannot reenact it just as I heard it, something loud like thunder or a siren of some sorts. It wasn't like a bird I had ever heard. I even remember looking at various birds and owls to see if there was some kind of bird that made that sound to no avail. After that night, we hadn't really experienced anything. We spent most of our money on hotel stays. We were only staying in the tent as little as possible until we moved out of town for good. So, on this, I don't think, and this is just a theory, I don't think that it was flying. I think whatever chased the husband out of that area, and we all know that Indian burial mounds and, sacred lands are in Oklahoma. Actually, they're in every state of the Union. And we know that Dogman, Bigfoot, have been seen, congregating, I guess, around these kind of ancient burial mounds. A couple of years ago, I did an interview with a guy from Maine who was talking about this ancient burial mound and seeing dogmen by it, kind of maybe protecting it or whatnot. Possibly whatever this creature was not happy with the people burning whatnot, garbage in a sacred area or whatever, and chased the husband, maybe ran by the wife, because they both heard bipedal running. But then maybe it was in the trees. She describes the sound with tree limbs cracking. Now, if it was some sort of bird, tree limbs would not be cracking. It would be above the tree limbs to fly, especially if it was a large bird. So, I don't know. That's just a theory. You don't have to take my theory. You can make your own. But maybe it fits. Who knows? Maybe you guys could take my theory and add on to it and make it fit for yourself. But to me, my theory fits for my thoughts. But let's move on. Today's second encounter. When I was about 9 years old, my grandparents lived about 10 miles away from a small town in Indiana. They lived in the middle of 2 cow pastures, and were about 3 miles away from the closest neighbor's house. The cow pasture regularly had cows in them, and would regularly come towards my grandparents' house because the creek separated the two properties. The cows being there, and the fact we lived out in the country, coyotes would often be on the property and try to feed on some of the cows as predators do. But I don't think I saw a coyote. One day, while I was at their house, I was sitting in the apple tree, relaxing and eating some apples. I fell asleep at around 8 p.m. and woke up at around 11 or midnight. I looked around and found it surprising that I was still in the tree. But then I heard something. I heard breathing that was not my own. I looked around the tree and didn't see anything. I even checked higher up in the tree. Then I looked below me. On the ground about 5 feet away from the tree was a coyote sitting and staring at me. It was huge, bigger than any coyote I had ever seen. Almost wolf size, I guess, but we don't have wolves in Indiana. Its eyes were strange. They were this dark, glowing orange, almost red. They looked just like they were glowing, almost like a cat's eyes were reflecting light. I could see its pupils. After a minute of me and this creature staring at each other, it opened its mouth, and I swear to God, soon after it opened its mouth, and I got a look at its teeth, it spoke in a deep male smoker's voice. It said, "Better get back inside, boy." Then it turned around and walked off. When it reached the tree line that was by the creek, I thought it stood up, and it looked like it had picked something up. I soon wasn't able to see it anymore, so I jumped down and full-on sprinted toward my grandparents' house. They were all asleep, so I ran to my room and dove into my bed. The next day, when I woke up, my grandparents were talking together. They said that the neighbor had called and said one of the cows had died. It looked like it had been dragged to the creek, but nothing was there other than blood. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, horrified. Had that thing really killed a cow, or was it just a normal pack of coyotes? I later started seeing it regularly. It would always be sitting like a dog, just right out in front of the tree line. Then it would slowly disappear into it. About once a month I would hear someone say something weird happened in the woods. On the same day I would see this creature. When I turned 14, my grandfather took me out on my first hunting trip, but before we left I saw it standing by the tree line. My grandfather didn't see it, and I rubbed my eyes and it was gone, so I didn't say anything. We got to the spot and we sat there for about an hour. We didn't see anything until then. We saw the thing, but this was the first time I saw it clearly. It was huge, larger than a large gray wolf, and it was all wrong. It looked extremely skinny and was bleeding. Some of its skin was missing, and I could see muscle. I think my grandfather saw it too because he was shaking like a leaf. Then something happened. A branch fell off a tree about 12 feet in front of me. It caused me to look up. I was horrified. I had never been so scared in my entire life, and still haven't. There was half a cow in the tree about 30 feet off the ground. My grandfather and I ran as fast as we could back to the house. And when we made it, I looked toward the tree line, and there it was, staring at us. My grandparents later moved. I've tried to research it, but the only thing I found is something that resembles a Dogman. I don't know. Oh, and finally, there was this. I learned about 5 months after my grandparents had moved, the farmer was found torn to shreds by his home, and that most of his livestock was killed leading up to his death. Tonight's third encounter. Back in 1999, when I was 12, I liked to explore the woods across the street from my house in rural Virginia. We lived in an area that was populated, but people didn't live on top of what we called the mountain. And to be honest, it wasn't a mountain, but we were in the foothills, and these mountains were higher than any other surrounding land. I would take my dogs, a golden retriever, St. Bernard, and my beagle mix. My neighbor's friendly little mixed breed would come too, and we would go through the culvert below the road and follow the creek up to a pond at the base of the mountain. We stayed gone all day, and it was nice to have no one around to spoil my fun. I mostly walked and played in the creek, but sometimes I climbed an old deer stand to look out across the creek. It was always peaceful and serene. Sometimes I would see deer grazing and drinking, or rabbits and squirrels playing. One time I saw a bear. I just stayed quiet, and it meandered away. I had to admit this was a great hiding spot and a playground. I like spending the long days just watching nature and not listening to my dad and his friends get drunk. I spent so much time there that I got used to the surrounding noises and smells. Very little ever surprised me there. That fall, puberty hit, my body changed, and I was not happy about it. And I spent a lot of time outside trying to avoid thinking about it. The changes made me closer to being an adult, and the thought of that was not great. This will be important later. I should mention that there is a pond itself was at the base of the mountain and surrounded by trees, mostly pine trees, if my memory serves. They were part of a tobacco farm and a small dirt track that led between another clump of trees and the ones that surrounded the pond. The closest houses were on each side of the forest, and of course mine across the street. The woods could be spooky sometimes, but it really was mind over matter. The creek that ran down from the pond went under the street and back in the direction of my house, and that's how I traveled back and forth. The creek that fed the pond was a mystery to me. I had never followed it very far because it led back into the mountains, and sometimes there were no paths to lead me back. Then one day I decided to follow the creek up and see what source of the pond was. It disappeared into the ground a few times, only to reemerge again. I was enjoying myself because I fancied myself as a little amateur explorer. My dogs trailed behind me, sniffing and playing. It was unusually quiet that day, but it was cloudy and cool, so maybe I thought all the animals were just hunkered down. I came to a place where the creek suddenly twisted around a bend of some rocks and disappeared into the ground again. I looked around for the creek and saw a trickle coming out of the ground ahead of me. I walked to where it was, anticipating the newness of the find. And this is when things got eerie. It was as if I could feel someone or something watching me. Now, I don't mean to sound like a Disney princess, but the animals were used to my smell and didn't take much trouble to avoid me. Wild animals in the woods sometimes followed me or were a little too close for comfort. This did not feel like that, not at all. I smelled this horrible stench, and honestly, it was worse than any animal corpse I had ever smelled before or since. I was nearly gagging. I was about to round the corner entirely to find the source when all three dogs came barreling toward me with their hackles raised and teeth bared, and that got my attention. The dogs began frantically herding me towards the pond, and when I went for the creek, they chased me towards the dirt road. I knew that there were trees down across it, but I would be at least the main road within 5 minutes, as opposed to 10 it would take to follow the creek carefully. As I hurried my way through the woods and up to the path, I could still smell that awful stench behind me. I was 1,000% positive that this was not a skunk, and not something I wanted to see. I kept going, terrified that whatever it was would show up. My dogs pushed me forward and stayed behind me, growling and snapping. I slowed my pace when I got to the main road, panting and huffing. I noticed my leg was wet, and I looked down to see I had bled through my jeans. Embarrassed and tired, I crossed the road and went inside. I stayed away from the woods. The next weekend I was at my dad's, but the following weekend I went back in and all was quiet. I stayed like this for a long time until around spring when it happened again. This time was a close call because I was in a tree stand when I heard a loud crunching steps. I smelled that same stench and made for the road the same way with my same 3 dogs losing their minds. This repeated itself every month. Not long after this, my dad and stepmom split up, and I no longer had access to the woods. I grew up and moved on. But I never understood what was going on until I watched a special on Sasquatch. The show described how women were sometimes herded by what Native Americans described as Sasquatch. When I put it all together, I wondered if my puberty had somehow alerted the thing to me, not to mention my bright red hair. I never knew for sure, but every time I look at that mountain, which is nearly every day because I live in its shadow, I remember something chased me and it smelled god-awful and sent my dogs into a panic. Well, obviously we know that Sasquatch is attracted to females and their time of the month. Anytime I hear a strange story like this, I always remember, and you guys know her in the comment section, Jane. And for those of you who have not heard her experience, it is absolutely terrifying and baffling, but also kind of, I guess, enlightening. I don't like using that word, but it teaches us something. Jane and her husband I think they were on their honeymoon or they had just gotten married. They were camping. They were pulling an RV behind them. They had their 2 Dobermans with them. Great dogs. They were not violent dogs. They were just real protective of Jane. And they pull off into this spot. Now I'm going off the top of my head, so I want to say Montana. Maybe Montana. I'm sure Jane will correct me in the comment section. And thank you, Jane, ahead of time. Now, they pull off the road. They're not at like a designated camping spot. They're just pulled off, park their camper, start a campfire, have dinner, yada, yada. They put their fire out. They get into their camper and, Jane and her husband are trying to fall asleep. The 2 dobies are on the floor, kind of whining, not growling, not barking, kind of like that whine growl, I guess. Not being aggressive, being scared. It actually urinated on the floor on their little bed that the dogs were lying on. And they look out the window, and there's this enormous humanoid figure. And the fire is now not like going, but it's glowing in amber color. Now, I don't know if squatches play with fire, if they got a lighter in their back pocket or whatnot. I'm just teasing. But it's kind of strange that, her husband had put that fire out. Maybe he didn't all the way, and maybe the squatch could smell like the embers and kind of stirred the fire up and got it going. Well, they end up leaving the next morning. And they pull into a kind of, country store. And they go in. There's this old guy behind the counter. And the husband tells the old fella about what happened. And Jane's in the store, and the old guy says, "Excuse me, ma'am." Or I don't even know if he was that cordial. He just maybe Is it your time of the month? And I'm not insulting anyone in the Southern. They probably didn't even sound like that. But just blatantly, your time of the month? And Jane says, yeah, why? And he says, they're attracted to that. Huh. How crazy is that, huh? Anyway, let's move on. Growing up in the mountains of North Georgia, camping and hiking were things me and my brother did so often, it was second nature. So anytime Ryan and I had a break from school, we would head straight out for the woods, packed our gear, let our parents know where we were going, and that was that, no questions asked. We decided to camp about midway through Jack's River Trail in the Coyote Wilderness. And it's a trail we knew fairly well, as we had used it a few times before to practice long hikes. We arrived at the trailhead around lunchtime, parked the car, got our gear out, and headed into the woods. We passed a few hikers as we moved along and asked them how the trail looked, and the answer was always the same: wet. Jack's River Trail probably crossed the river 50 times as it went along its 17-mile-plus journey, and with the colder temperatures of late fall setting in, it was harder for the trail to stay dry. So we moved deeper into the trail and started to look for a place to set up camp. This is where Ryan and I made our first mistake. You see, Ryan and I have a rule. We don't camp near people if at all possible. Call us paranoid, but the last thing we want to do is for some people to drag us out of our tents and into the woods, never to be seen again. So we always camp pretty decent way off the trail and in an area that's not popular with overnight camping. Roughly 2.5 hours or so, we found what we thought was a perfect place to set up camp for 2 nights that would be out there. We came up to the Horseshoe Bend and ventured about half a mile off the trail into the clearing and set up. We built a teepee fire, lay for the night, and pitched our tents in either side. After setting up and unloading, we decided to walk back to the trail and go exploring around some of the many swimming holes of Jack's River. This is during Thanksgiving break, and I remember being surprised at how few people were on the trail. Maybe it was the weather or the fact that this was early in the week, but there didn't seem to be anyone hiking, much less staying the night. Around 5 o'clock, Ryan and I headed back to camp to start our fire, make dinner, and settle in for the night. As soon as the sun began to set, the cold rushed in. We added more wood to the fire and sat close and enjoyed conversation. Ryan was 2 years behind me in school. I was a senior, and he was a sophomore, but growing up, we had always been close. We always hung out in the same groups, played the same sports, had the same hobbies. Around 9, we were settled in comfortably around the fire. I had just texted our mom to let her know that we were safe and getting ready for bed. And I remember we were talking about dreading going to our grandparents' house for Thanksgiving and having the same awkward conversations we had each year with family we only saw on the holidays when things were starting to get strange. We were no stranger to sounds in the woods, and these woods were full of animals, from deer to black bear and even the random wild boar. If you are in the woods enough, you'll learn to distinguish certain sounds, and what we were hearing I can only chalk up to odd. What Ryan and I heard was what sounded like someone sneaking around slowly, just out of eyesight. With an animal walking on 4 legs, you hear a tighter group of steps, but what we were hearing sounds very distinct, like a bipedal when walking slowly or trying to move without making too much sound. I remember we both pulled out our flashlights and shone it in the direction we felt the sounds were coming from, but that was weird. Whenever we would fix our lights on a spot we thought the sound coming from that location, the sound would suddenly change. It was as if there were multiple things walking around us, and that's when the whistling started. At first, I thought it was just the wind, and I remember thinking maybe the wind is just throwing leaves around, and what we were hearing was nothing but the wilderness all around us. Ryan looked at me and asked me if I was hearing it. I didn't answer and was trying to focus hard on each individual sound. 2 consecutive notes of roughly a 3 to 4 second gap, and then 2 more consecutive notes over and over. Ryan kept asking if I heard that. I put my finger to my lips, trying to keep him from talking anymore. The fear I felt was incredible. My jaw was tight, my fists were clenched, knowing I wasn't ready for whatever was out there, if it was anything at all. The whistling continued for what felt like forever, but thinking it through was probably 5 minutes when Ryan finally yelled into the darkness, "Hey, quiet!" The whistling stopped, the crunching in the wood stopped, nothing. I was pissed. I looked at Ryan with a WTF look. He shrugged his shoulders. "I had to do something," he said. I just shook my head. We sat there in silence for a couple minutes when the woods erupted with noise. Something or someone was circling around our campsite. The whistling came back, 2 consecutive notes with the same 3 to 4 second gap, then 2 more. How could something or someone be whistling this loud without cracking while running? I don't know. I was done. I stood up, shining my flashlight in all directions, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever or whoever was messing with us. Nothing. It felt close enough to touch, but we never saw the thing. And that's when the movement stopped, but the whistling had not. It was so loud, inhumanly loud, I looked at Ryan and told him to call the police. Now this is the part I will never forget. The part I never like to talk about. While Ryan was on the phone with the dispatcher and telling them our location and what was going on, I stepped around the fire toward my tent. Inside my bag I had a 6-inch fixed blade that I always carried and thought I would feel a bit more confident and comfortable with it in my hand, more than just my flashlight. As I went to unzip the tent, trying to keep my eyes toward the woods, I heard some movement directly in front of me. I swept my light up in front of me and was there for maybe 2 seconds. Whatever this thing was, it was about 5 feet up a tree. Everything about it was wrong. Its arms, legs, neck, fingers, everything, and it was fast. As soon as the light hit it, it launched itself backward off the tree. I heard it land, but it either jumped an impossible distance or landed in the thicket because I heard it but never saw it. I don't think I have ever yelled so loud. I ran back to where Ryan was. He kept asking me what I saw, but I could not answer. I just kept thinking about what I saw. Maybe 10 minutes later, we saw a couple flashlight beams coming through the woods, and 3 guys came into view, asking if everything was okay. I settled a bit and started asking them if they had seen or heard anything. All they said was they heard a lot of movement and commotion, and then they heard my scream, and that's when they headed in our direction. I tried to explain what happened without sounding crazy, but I didn't. One of the guys walked around a bit and came back and said he didn't see anything. Ryan told them that we called the police, and roughly 30 minutes later a park ranger showed up. Ryan and I tried to explain everything to him, but he just chalked it up to a curious animal or some campers trying to mess with us. Either way, Ryan and I decided we weren't staying the night. We packed our stuff and walked out with the ranger. He took our statement, and we got to our car and drove home. Ryan and I did not talk about what happened that night, but neither of us had been back to Jack's River Trail, and we'll probably never go again. And there you have it, folks, today's bonus. which I'm so glad I was able to share with you guys, and I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did sharing it with you. I'd like to thank you all for supporting the channel. It is your support that helps the channel to continue to grow and go, and what gives people like us a chance and a place to share our experiences and theories judgment-free, just simply treated with the respect that we all deserve. Thank you. Everyone, please stay safe, happy, healthy, and ever vigilant, keeping an eye on our children, pets, family, friends. These creatures are real. They are out there and dangerous. Share this information with those you love and care about, and it may just help save their lives someday. And until next time, never stop asking questions, never stop searching for the truth, and God bless.